You assume that those star players you take in the first couple rounds of your fantasy drafts are going to lead the way to a championship team. You assume they're just going to be studs. And you'd be wrong. Here's some of the players we're avoiding in the early rounds. These could be landmines that wind up destroying your draft before it even gets underway.
Now, if you're thinking, how can you be drafting? Well, then you need to check out Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy has best ball drafts going full swing right now, all the way up until the season. They have drafts ranging from $4 to $500 with prize pools ranging from $100,000 to $15 million. That's right, $15 million in their flagship Best Ball Mania 5. If you haven't tried Underdog Fantasy yet, this is the time to do it. Just make sure when you sign up, you use our promo code ENDGAME and take advantage of this special offer. They're going to give you a special pick plus up to $250 in bonus cash. Go to UnderdogFantasy.com, sign up using promo code ENDGAME, start drafting right now, and take advantage of this special offer.
All right, Chris, who's the first star player that you're going out of your way to not draft?
I don't think I've drafted Stefon Diggs once this year, and I probably won't draft Stefon Diggs once this year. I really don't understand how people are hyped up on Stefon Diggs this year. Look at him last year, down the second half of the season. He was absolutely terrible. Is he getting dusty? Is he getting old? Well, if you follow Matt Harmon like we do, a reception perception, maybe a little bit. He certainly was not as good in the vertical game last year as he had been in his entire career. He was still good on like the shorter routes, the in-breaking routes, which is still valuable in the NFL, but he doesn't have that deep aspect to his game, which could be a sign that he is losing a little bit of a step. But let's imagine you don't believe that. Let's imagine you believe the narrative that he didn't want to play for the Bills, so he wasn't trying very hard last year. Okay, I don't agree, but let's say you're right. How can you possibly look at his situation this year and say it's better than last year? He's going from being the true number one, really the number one, number two, number three target in that offense with Josh Allen to now being in an offense where he has to share targets with Nico Collins, who is significantly better than anybody else who was on the Bills, and Tank Dell, who was also significantly better than anybody else on the Bills. And you can't argue that CJ Stroud is an upgrade over Josh Allen. You can argue it's not a downgrade, but there is no way you could tell me you think CJ Stroud is an upgrade over Josh Allen. At best, it's lateral. So he's going from a situation where he was the obvious number one target monster in a Josh Allen offense to a situation where he's not even clear that he's going to be the number two, maybe the number three target. We really don't know how this is going to shake out. I don't see how Stefon Diggs, even if he isn't dust, is somehow anywhere close to what he was in Buffalo, and you still got to draft him in the second round of your drafts. I can't do it here. There's no way. It's very hard for any offense to support three high-end fantasy wide receivers, and for as good as CJ Stroud is, I don't expect him to do it. So for me, I'm just taking whichever Texans wide receiver falls the farthest, and it's almost never Stefon Diggs.
Yeah, I hear you, because honestly, after round one, there's several receivers that I just don't feel great taking that early. Talk about second, third round. They all have some degree of risk. And yeah, sure, there's upside, which is why they're being drafted early. But I really am questioning now, should we be taking Deebo Samuel still as if he's one of the best receivers outside round one? I'm not. I'm really scared to death to take Deebo that early. Look, I get, we've seen him as a fantasy stud before. Remember back in 2021, he was the number 3 wide receiver in PPR scoring. But we also have to remember why he was one of the top scorers in fantasy, because he wound up scoring 8 rushing touchdowns. He was basically used as a running back half the time to fill in for the fact that they needed a running back because their leading rusher that year was Eli Mitchell, who was hurt a lot. They did not have Christian McCaffrey back then. Now they do. All right, now the next year, injuries, right? Very disappointing follow-up. He wound up as the wide receiver 28, and that's even on a point per game basis. So it wasn't just the fact that he missed games. He just wasn't nearly as efficient. And then last year, kind of settled into high-end wide receiver 2, I guess you could say, wound up as the wide receiver 15. So this year, of course, what happens every draft season, we treat these players as if they're going to do the exact same thing they did last season. He's being drafted as a wide receiver 15, basically a high-end wide receiver 2. But here's the thing. I see that as his ceiling, his absolute ceiling, because we look at what he did last year. It was still pretty good, right? He managed to stay healthy. Hey, sure, maybe that happens again. But there's also the fact that they drafted a wide receiver in round 1, potentially to replace either him or Brandon Ayuk or both. And then they drafted a receiver in round 4. Look, there's only so many targets to go around here. And we know with Debo, there's a potential out here. And I don't like getting into situations with receivers who have contract issues because this can affect them in a lot of ways. Of course, there could be some animosity here. There could be the fact that, maybe I don't want to go out there and gut it out through these injuries. And Debo has had plenty of injuries because they want to stay fresh. They want to stay healthy for the offseason and negotiations. So I don't know. To me, there's more risk than potential reward here with Debo. I don't see him bringing back the kind of return, and I especially don't want to take him as my number 1 receiver if I did go RB in round 1 or round 2. Now, everybody loves the rookies, but man, sometimes we can be way too high on them.
I think people are still way too high on Malik Neighbors. Obviously, was a great prospect. We had a lot of hope for Malik Neighbors going into the NFL draft, and then he landed with the Giants. And look, sometimes you have to take how you felt about a guy before the draft and just completely forget about it and look at the current situation. Malik Neighbors is great. I think Malik Neighbors is going to be great in the NFL. I think he's going to have a great career. But it's going to take him getting away from Daniel Jones. I'm sorry. I have been burned too many times over my fantasy football years by bad QBs saying like, well, this talented wide receiver can do it. I am done doing that. I don't want a piece of a guy, especially that you still have to draft, sometimes late round 2, early round 3 with Daniel Jones as his QB. Daniel Jones has only thrown over 3,000 yards in his career twice. The most yards he's ever thrown for in a season was 3,200 yards. And that's the year a couple years ago where the Giants thought they'd struck gold and then signed him to that big contract that I'm sure they're now regretting. His best per game yardage total for his career, 232 yards. This is not what makes up a fantasy-friendly wide receiver. We're talking worst of the worst QB play in real life and for fantasy. And look, I get it. Malik Neighbors is a great guy. He's great after the catch. Maybe you just get the ball in his hands and let him do his things. And sure, there's going to be moments where he does that, but this is the NFL. He's not going to do it week after week. He's not going to make up for all of Daniel Jones's shortcomings every single week of the season. But I feel like people are still locked into how they felt about this guy before the draft, and they can't get over the fact that he's playing with Daniel Jones. And if it's not Daniel Jones, then what? We get Tommy DeVito? I mean, is he the backup right now? I really don't even know. So Malik Neighbors, loved him as a prospect, loved him before the draft, hated where he went, and I just don't see how he's going to perform the way we want him to with Daniel Jones. And look, in recent memory, we have guys like Garrett Wilson, went to the Jets, wasn't as good as we expected him to be year 1. Chris Olave went to the Saints, not as good as we had hoped in year 1. Drake London went to the Falcons, hasn't been good for 2 years. I mean, it's just not easy for these pass catchers when they're playing with horrible quarterbacks. Malik Neighbors, unfortunately, got one of the worst situations a receiver could get in. There's no way I can take a rookie attached to Daniel Jones in the 3rd round, not even one as talented as Malik Neighbors.
Now, talent alone isn't everything. Opportunity matters. So hear me out here. Even though this is a running back on one of the most fantasy-friendly offenses, arguably the most fantasy-friendly offense that you could have, Miami Dolphins, I'm steering clear of Devon Achane in redraft. I just am. Look, in best ball, yeah, sure, take him. I get it, that league-winning upside, although I still can't believe how high his ADP is, but still, best ball, fine. Dynasty, sure, go for it. But in redraft, again, the risk here is a lot higher than people realize. And so let me go back to last year, his rookie debut. Remember, he got off to a slow start because there were some injuries. And then there were more injuries later, which I'll get to. Okay, but what do we all remember from last year? The Denver game, right? His coming out party where they just demolished that Broncos defense and he went insane, scored 4 touchdowns. All right, and then he had 2 more really good games before getting hurt, right? Missed several games. They had a bye, came back, got hurt again. Okay, and then he was fine, but he was not at that same level. And he had, I think, 2 games over 20 fantasy points, but the rest of it was just okay. Now, you could say, well, it was just usage. They didn't give him the ball enough. What makes us think that they're just going to all of a sudden make him a workhorse back? Maybe the fact that he did get hurt so much and the fact that he's still a very small back and that they just drafted Jalen Wright. Oh, and Raheem Mostert is still there and he led the league in touchdowns. Maybe Devon Achane just gets the same amount of carries as last year. Maybe it's not that different. Maybe he does have some games that he has huge output and then some games where he just doesn't do that much. And look, this is how the running back landscape is, right? You're going to have guys who have peaks and valleys. That's just normal. And that's fine, but are you really going to draft him as your RB1? Is that really what you want to roll with? Instead of a true workhorse back like a Jonathan Taylor, somebody who's going to get that consistent, amount of touches every single week? I just think between the injury risk and the inconsistent usage, I just don't think it's worth drafting him this high, because if he does go out for a prolonged period of time, or if he just underachieves, which is possible, then you're going to be left wanting, and pinning your hopes on this one running back, that's going to wreck your draft, because then you're going to have to be playing catch up the rest of the season. Sometimes even those tried and true veterans can be risky.
Yeah, I think Davante Adams is extremely risky this year. I mean, you look at it last year, he averaged 15 points per game, which you say, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. Sure, there's nothing wrong with that if he's like your wide receiver 3 or your wide receiver 2 or whatever it is. But kind of like Stephon Diggs, you still have to draft this guy in the second round. That means for a lot of you who take running back in the first round, he's going to be your number 1 wide receiver. And then again, you're banking on the fact that 32-year-old Davante Adams playing with either Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew is going to be at least as good as he was last year and doesn't get any worse. And that the Raiders' offense doesn't get worse and the Raiders' passing game doesn't get worse. That's a lot of things to bet on when the quarterbacks, again, are Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. I don't want to spend a second-round pick on an aging wide receiver who just had one of his worst seasons in like 5 years, and significantly worse than any season he had prior over the last however many 5 years or however long this guy's been a stud. Like, we saw a significant drop last year in every stat across the board, except really targets, because they force-fed him, which is even more concerning that he got 175 targets and was still this bad. So I'm not going to bet on a second-round wide receiver attached to either Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew, who showed serious signs of decline last year and will probably show more signs of decline, because that's kind of how this goes. Guys don't decline and then all of a sudden get better. Guys usually just decline, and then they're gone. Look at Julio Jones as the most recent example of a Davante Adams type of guy, a big, physical, athletic wide receiver who was an absolute stud for many years, and then like that, he was gone. Not saying that's going to happen to Davante Adams this year, but it is the risk. And the other risk here is that he's not gone. He's just bad, and you wasted a second-round pick. There is no way I can take Davante Adams in round 2 in my drafts, and I don't think you should either.
Yeah, the Raiders offense might not be that great still. You'd think going from the Raiders to the Packers would be an upgrade for Josh Jacobs, but I don't think so. In fact, it's a downgrade, and I'll tell you why. In Las Vegas, Jacobs was the backfield. Like, he was the do-everything back, and even switching head coaches didn't matter. Antonio Pierce said, he's our guy, right? Force-fed him. He was one of the few workhorse backs in the league. That's changed now because Green Bay just does not roll that way. And I've been saying this, which is why I really like Marshawn Lloyd as kind of a sneaky late-round pick. But also, he came out and said it. Just the other day, this happened. He said, no matter who the runner is, we like to platoon those guys. This is just a philosophical thing. They want to keep their lead back fresh. It just happens to be Josh Jacobs instead of Aaron Jones. So look, Aaron Jones was good at times last year, but he missed a few games. He was hurt. There also were some games where he just didn't get as much usage as you'd like. Get used to that if you draft Josh Jacobs this year, because it's going to be the same thing. Need I remind you, too, that last year Josh Jacobs, despite being one of those really bell cow backs who got so much usage, wasn't really that good. Remember, early on, he was a full-out bust. He only averaged 3.5 yards per carry. And so I don't see how a guy who hasn't been as efficient lately and now is going to get fewer touches. Yeah, it's a better offense, but you need opportunities. And look, I think Marshawn Lloyd is a really good complementary back. Jordan Love has now finally developed into a good quarterback. So many options there to pass it to. I think you're going to be disappointed, and especially with Jacobs, where he's going still early in those first 4 rounds typically. If you go receiver, or if you go, let's say, 2 receivers and a tight end or a quarterback, whatever it is, and you wait and you're like, that's fine, I'll take Jacobs as my anchor. Man, that's an easy way to wreck your draft. Those could wind up being some of the worst draft picks you make in the early rounds, but there's hope. If you take some of these players, these are the top 12 players in all of fantasy. You want to make sure you get as many of these as possible.